Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darian Weltman-Swit, and I'm co-founder of Article3.org, which is a nonprofit organization working to strengthen the human rights philanthropy ecosystem. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today for this program on the fight to end child marriage. It's so wonderful to be featuring Princess Mabel van Orange from the Netherlands, and I know you're all in for a treat. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club and to everyone joining us here today in person and online for this timely and important conversation. And now I'm delighted to welcome Princess Mabel van Orange to the Commonwealth Club and back to the Bay Area. Known as Princess to many, to those of us in the human rights community, she is known to us as Mabel. She's a fierce, tireless, and courageous champion for the rights of women and girls around the globe. As a social entrepreneur and founder of Vow for Girls, she is leading a global movement to end child marriage. I mentioned that today's conversation is timely. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a milestone document that set out to establish that rights fundamental to being human, such as dignity and freedom, must be protected and advanced. These principles apply to girls, including the right to determine one's own future and love on their own terms. This is Mabel's mission, to ensure that these basic rights enshrined 75 years ago are accessible and applied evenly to all girls everywhere, so that no girl is a bride. Mabel undoubtedly will not rest until all girls have such rights and become universally empowered with both voice and choice. I'm also very pleased to welcome our moderator for today, Randy Newcomb. Randy is a senior advisor of the Omidyar Group, a diverse collection of entities and initiatives that strive to catalyze social impact globally. Randy is also co-founder of Humanity United, an organization dedicated to cultivating the conditions for enduring peace and freedom, with a focused portfolio created under Randy's leadership to eradicate modern-day slavery. Randy is immensely respected in the human rights, human trafficking, and philanthropy sectors. Given his background and experience, I can think of no one better to help guide this crucial conversation. Please join me in welcoming to the Commonwealth Club stage Princess van Orange in conversation with Randy Newcomb. Thank you.
Thank you, Darian, and welcome everybody to the second day of spring, which actually feels like the second day of winter. And it's a delight to be with you, the hardy few that won't allow 70-mile winds and storms to keep us away from these kind of important conversations. So thank you for joining us today and for this really extraordinary opportunity to be in conversation with, I should say, my friend, Mabel, and who I will say has been an inspiration for me and for our work at the Omidyar Group and for the Omidyar family for years and years. So Mabel, welcome to this conversation. Mabel, as many of you will know, has dedicated her career to ending the practice of child marriage, as Darian was noting. And I wasn't aware that child marriage impacts 12 million girls annually, which is really extraordinary. So Mabel, we're going to want to talk more about that. Her latest venture, as Darian mentioned, is with Vow for Girls, which we'll hear more about, which invests in efforts to support girls whose futures are at risk. During the last decade, Mabel has played a catalytic role in the global movement to end child marriage, including the creation and growth of 3 entities, which are Girls Not Brides, the Girls First Fund, and Vow for Girls. And so actually we're going to be having a conversation today. So that conversation is not just between Mabel and myself. I'm hoping that you will have questions, and we'll get to those questions as well as those online, that you'll use the chat box feature online, and we'll bring your questions forward for this really what I think is an extraordinary conversation. So that's all of our housekeeping, Mabel. So we're going to jump into this. And I always enjoy conversations with individuals like you because I find your biography so interesting. And I know enough about you that you've had a very, very interesting trajectory over the course of your life and have done extraordinary work. So I'm really interested in talking about what kind of brings you to this work. I know you well enough to know that there are moments would have been very easy for you to say no more. You know, I'm going a different direction. But over the course of your life, you've consistently worked for causes related to conflict, around failed states, now child marriage, for decades. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious what brings you into that, and what calls you to continue to do this kind of work?
Ooh, well, we start immediately quite personally, obviously. First of all, I would like to thank the Commonwealth Club and especially Darian for hosting this conversation. And Randy mentioned to the fact that we are friends, and maybe it would be nice to explain how we know each other, because we actually met about 15 years ago, I think, when I became the first CEO of an organization called The Elders, which is a group that Nelson Mandela created of former heads of state and people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations. And they had come together to basically to promote peace and to bring justice to the world. And Randy was one of the members of the advisory council, and that's where we first met and became friends. And it's very nice to do this conversation together.
Yeah.
What has been driving me? It's so hard to know really what drives you, but I do think one of the things that makes that I find it so hard to give up trying to make the world a better place is that I'm really upset about the fact that there is so much. The world can be so incredibly unfair, and I first experienced that when I was quite young, and I grew up in a middle-class family in the Netherlands, and my father would travel to Latin America for his work. And he would come back with stories about the poverty that he saw there in different countries in Latin America. And so at a very young age, it made me aware that the things that I was taking for granted, like going to school, having hospitals, all these things, that they were actually not normal in other parts of the world. And it created that sense of injustice. Like, how can this be that just because I have the luck of being born in the Netherlands, that I have these opportunities, and that girls and boys who are born elsewhere don't? And it made me determined to try to fight that injustice. And so fast forward then, I ended up at the end of my studies at the United Nations doing an internship working, looking at the financing of peacekeeping operations. And this was the time when, in the early 90s, when genocide was taking place in Bosnia. And again, there was this sense of like, how can this be? This is wrong, this is not fair, this is unjust. And so it made me decide that I wanted to become basically an activist and try to stand up and try to help to make sure that the human rights of people, regardless of where they're born, and the opportunities, regardless again of where people grow up, that they are available to all. And so that has kind of, for the last almost 30 years that I've been working, has really been driving me. And that's where then also the work around child marriage comes in, because once you know that there is such a big injustice, it's very hard, at least for me, to sit still and to stop.
Yeah, well, you actually referenced, and I want to build off of our time together with the elders in those early years. With you think about Archbishop Tutu, who was our first board chair for the elders organization, Kofi Annan, and I think what I found unique about being in relationship with both Archbishop Tutu and Kofi Annan was kind of the level of moral clarity. And that there were certain human rights issues in the world that we needed to be extraordinarily clear about, and that we could not tolerate. And I found in our conversations in the Elders organization that this issue around child marriage was one of those where there was just a level of clarity. And what was your sense? You were the CEO in those times and during those years, and I think you must have really been supporting the elders just to be completely clear about the importance of mitigating practices such as child marriage.
Yeah. Well, I remember that we came to the issue of child marriage because the elders, at some point, this was in 2009, I remember we had a meeting in Paris, and the elders said, look, we have to work on the issue of gender equality. The fact that men and women, girls and boys are still not equal is one of the biggest injustices in the 21st century. And it was President Carter, one of the members of the elders, who said, look, when we look at gender inequality, what we really should look at is how religion and tradition, which normally are forces for good in our lives, too often get misused in order to justify discrimination against girls and women. And he had experienced that in his own church. He had changed churches because of that. And the elders spoke out about this through statement and through op-eds, and that really resonated and was very interesting. We got people from all over the world saying, thanks for speaking out. This is so true. I can't say this. I'm a woman. I experience the inequality every day. I can't say it, but now I can refer to what you guys have said. And so we realized we were onto something, and we started looking at, like, is there an example of religion and tradition being misused in order to discriminate against girls and women? And we then kind of came across the issue of child marriage, which at that time was getting very little attention globally. I mean, you would go to these big United Nations development conferences and the UNGA Week and all these big events, and people wouldn't talk about it. And we then realized, as you were saying, Randy, that it is 12 million girls who get married every year. Now think about it. 12 million is an enormous amount. But basically, 12 million is a girl every 3 seconds. So that's a girl getting married, another one, another one, another one, and it goes on and on and on. And not only is this obviously an enormously big problem, but the consequences are very, very big. Because these girls who get married, that's not like, oh, you know, like how we would think about marriages. We think about cake and beautiful dresses and festivities and dancing and family and friends and happy ever after. But for these girls, their day they get married is the day they have to leave school, in most cases, if they were ever allowed to go to school. It's the day that they have to, you know, have sex and might get pregnant while they still have the bodies of children. So they're not ready for childbirth. And so maternal health challenges, including maternal death, are much higher in that age group. These girls are much more likely to become the victims of violence. And so there's a whole... the consequences go far beyond just, you know, like, oh, this is a girl ending up in a marriage. In fact, you know, we have these famous Sustainable Development Goals, and 8 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are directly or indirectly related to child marriage. So if you ever want to make sure that you get every girl into school, you have to work on ending child marriage. If you want to reduce child mortality, or if you want to reduce maternal mortality, again, it makes sense to think about how to bring child marriage into the equation. And so we felt like, look, if this problem is so big, and if the consequences, including for eradicating poverty, are so enormous, let's try to, that's what the elders then decided, let's try to get this issue on the global agenda and give it the visibility that it actually deserves. And of course, working with these amazing individuals like Kofi Annan, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, like Graça Machel, like Ila Bhatt, they could do this in a way that nobody could say, hey, this is none of your business. You know, you're foreigners, but no, this was happening in their own countries. And so they really helped to give the issue, I think, the visibility that it deserves.
Yeah, I want to build off that a bit. We find ourselves at this really interesting moment in the first 25 years of the 21st century where sort of East and West are beginning to balkanize, and there's a certain authoritarian who's causing horrific suffering in Ukraine right now. But I can imagine some of these more traditional societies, these authoritarian leaders or others, saying to the West, kind of, hey, West, keep your Western modern values off of our traditional cultural values. This is for us to determine. And I mean, how do you address that? How do you speak to that? Well, this kind of divide that we find ourselves in increasingly?
I mean, we have to look at why child marriage happens. And the reasons why it happens vary per place. In some cases, people do it just because they don't know any better. They've done it generation after generation. In some cases, people do it because marrying a daughter off means one less mouth to feed. And if you're poor, that can make a difference then for the children who remain in the family. In some cases, this is done because of the fears that a girl will get pregnant before marriage and might thereby dishonor herself or her family. It's sometimes done because there are no alternatives, like education. It always happens because of gender inequality. The fact that girls are considered less than boys. And the number of times that I've heard people say, like, oh, girls are a burden, you need to get rid of them as soon as you can, it's horrendous. But in the end, I believe that parents do not want to harm their children. Parents do this because they might not see alternatives, either because they're not familiar with alternatives or because these alternatives are not available. And what we see all over the world, because there's now a whole lot more work going on in this field, is that people from the countries where you have high rates of marriage actually want to change this. There are smaller and bigger local NGOs all over the world that are working to end child marriage. So of course you're right, you cannot impose this from the outside. But what we see is that when you empower people in the countries where child marriage is very high, and that's in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, but also in Latin America, this is happening. When you empower people from those countries and ask them, what do you want to do? They basically want to create that kind of change. So it is, a lot of it is, there's a lot of talk nowadays about the decolonialization of aid. The idea that, indeed, we shouldn't come in from, whether it is New York or London or Berlin, and tell people what to do. You need to empower the people on the ground whose lives are concerned about the kind of change that you want to make. And so everything that we are trying to do, we can talk a bit more about it, to end child marriage is all related to this idea of, like, you empower the people, whether it's in Zambia or it is in Nepal or whether it is in the Dominican Republic, you empower those people to do what they think is right. And we see that these projects make a difference. You see then that communities decide that they no longer want to marry their daughters at a young age because they realize that actually what seems to be the right thing to do, or what they thought was the right thing to do, is actually harmful. Not just for the girls, but also for the communities.
Yeah, I want to get inside some very specific interventions that you might recommend, and I also want to talk more about Vow and what you're doing in terms of some of the branding and cross-branding work that you do there. But one particular way maybe to come into this is that, in recent days we hear more and more framing of these issues within the context of a polycrisis, meaning what are we experiencing in the 21st century where there is this kind of compounding effect of a variety of crises? So if you take sort of a global recession, the climate crisis, and food insecurity, and you see those compounding together, what are the implications of that? And I can imagine that as you think about the climate crisis, a global recession and food insecurity, that actually increases the vulnerability of girls to early marriage.
Yeah.
And so what are your thoughts about that?
So we have seen in the last decade, with more attention to the issue of child marriage, with more money going to the issue of child marriage, not enough, but more, that that there is a trend in terms of the percentage is going down. And so where a decade ago, about 1 out of every 4 girls in the world would get married before the age of 18, that's now 1 out of every 5. And that's, of course, fantastic news, because that means that an issue that is, a complex issue, there isn't an easy solution. It's not like here, here's the pill you take or the injection you get and then everything will be fine. We know that progress can be made. We need to, however, accelerate that. And we need to partially accelerate that because some of the countries that have the highest rates of child marriage is also where you have big demographic growth. So the worst in the world is Niger. 3 out of every 4 girls are married by the age of 18. Niger is also the place where women on average have slightly more than 7 children. Now you can imagine that if you could keep girls out of marriage up till the age of 18, that probably means that they will have at least 2 or 3 children less in their lifetime, which will have an enormous impact on demographic growth in Niger. And so that is one thing that is a kind of challenge that we really need to tackle if we want to get to this world where there is no more child marriage. But the other thing is, like you're saying, Randy, is the poly crisis, which is a term I hadn't heard until a few weeks ago, and I find it an intriguing term. We've been in the child marriage movement, or the ending child marriage movement, we've been talking about the 4 C's that are basically challenging us. One is COVID, with schools being closed, girls staying at home, all kinds of consequences because of that. Basically, we've seen an increase in child marriages, and they think that because of COVID, we will have, in the coming years, about 10 million extra child marriages. Secondly, we have conflict. And that relates, especially when you look now at the situation, in Ukraine. Food prices globally have gone up, which means that for the poorest families all over the world, it is hard to feed the whole family, which then increases the pressures of marrying young daughters off. Thirdly, there's the climate crisis. And as you probably know, once again, when things get tough, it's the girls and the women who are the first victims. And we see, therefore, with the consequences of what is happening with natural disasters, climate crisis, the child marriages go up. For example, in Bangladesh, when the floods come, we always see a peak in child marriage rates because people are afraid that their house might be washed away. And therefore, it's safer to marry your daughter off when you're still of a certain standing than once your house is no longer there and you're considered poor. And the 4th C is conservatism. And what that is doing to the rights of girls and women. So yes, we have a bit of a battle ahead, but my strong belief is that the fact that not everything is easy doesn't mean that we can say we'll give up. To the contrary, we know that every girl who you keep in school will actually, in her lifetime, each year of extraditional schooling, she'll earn 10 to 15% more. And we also know that girls and women who earn a salary invest that in their families and thereby help to lift their children, their husbands, their families out of poverty. And so it makes sense to do this work. And I know it sounds like a big thing, 12 million girls that we need to reach. But first of all, these amazing girls that I meet, when you hear their stories about I was at a risk of getting married, but I convinced my parents that I should stay in school for a few more years. And now I am actually earning a living and I can afford, the medical bills of my parents. And these girls are proud and their parents realize that these were the right choices. And every girl who we can keep in school and for whom we can make sure that she doesn't end up in an early marriage, that's a life won, so to say. And I'm convinced that we can get to a kind of tipping point where, at some point, you have so many girls who are not getting married that we go over from that kind of of course, in this community, our daughters get married by the age of, let's say, 14, to, of course, we're not going to marry our daughters by the age of 14.
Amazing. And it seems that kind of a superpower in that mix is education in many ways. And it, just as an aside, I had this most extraordinary experience yesterday. We met yesterday afternoon to catch up, and a taxi cab driver picked me up, and I was talking to the taxi cab driver. He was a young Afghani man, and he said, you know, you're actually the first person I've given a ride since I just left the federal building for my citizenship induction ceremony. And which almost made me cry that I got to be his first ride for him becoming a citizen in the US. And we engaged in this conversation about his experience in Afghanistan, and he had worked for USAID and was able to come out, and during that week of the evacuation in August of 2021. But he said to me, he said, you know, I have 3 sisters, 2 are doctors, 1's a lawyer, and he said, under this current government, they would never be allowed to go to school. And he said the difference for my 3 sisters to be able to go to school is the difference between night and day. Yeah. And it just seems like education is this superpower that really opens up opportunities. And I'm sure this is true with
absolutely
mitigating child marriage.
Absolutely. And we know that the countries where we have seen we know that the countries where we've seen steep declines in rates of child marriage are countries where governments have kind of put their weight behind the idea of girls' education. So it is definitely a superpower, but it is not always enough. And so the kind of projects that we see that work locally, whether it is in Bihar in northern India, or whether it is in Mozambique, or whether it is in Senegal, they vary a little bit. Like sometimes it is indeed making sure that, for example, parents have the money to afford the school uniforms, or the books and pens that are necessary for girls go to school. Sometimes, I mean, I was in Nepal recently, and a lot of the work that we're supporting there actually centers around girls' clubs, where girls come together after school and they learn about their rights, and they learn that they have agency, and they build friendships, and they learn all kinds of life skills, including about sexual and reproductive health and how you can avoid pregnancy. And they learn, sometimes kind of job skills and earning small amounts of money, sewing or what have you. And some of these, talking to these girls, that has been transformational for them. If only, for example, they have created bonds. I mean, we find it completely normal that girls have, peers and friends and whatever. But in many of these places, girls are, once they become reach adolescent age, they're not longer allowed to leave school of home, and so they don't have those kinds of friendships. And here we met then these girls who because of these projects have made these bonds, and then when they find out that one of their friends might be married off, they all collectively go to the house of the parents and say, look, this is actually not a good thing to do. And so they help to convince parents to stay out of marriage. We've seen in other places that what works is to get the elders of the community, whether that is religious leaders or local traditional leaders or the teachers, the fathers, to basically come together and have a dialogue, week after week after week, talking about like, why is our community so poor? What could we do to change it? And they come to realize that this practice of child marriage is actually one of the things that is holding their community back. And so they decide to change it. And for example, in Senegal, there is a program where 8,000 communities have decided to stop cutting their girls, female genital mutilation, and to stop marrying their girls at a young age. Now, that's of course amazing. And that creates a kind of, a movement that is going to have, hopefully for all the girls in Senegal, mean that child marriage is going to end there. So what we know is that yes, education is a critical part of the solution, but sometimes, other things are needed locally as well. And this goes back to that question of like, how do you then decide what needs to be supported? And much of this work cannot be determined by United Nations agencies or by big international NGOs. You really need to make sure that local organizations who know what's happening in their community, why are girls being married? Is it because of poverty? Is it because of lack of education? Is it because of this issue of tradition? What is the reason? people who understand what is happening in the community, what is needed to change it, and who holds the power of change, those are the people you need to empower. And what we see is that it doesn't cost a whole lot of money. I mean, a lot of the programs that are being supported by VOW for Girls, which we will be talking about, the annual budget is around $40,000, $50,000. Now, I'm not saying that is no money, but that's not a lot. You know, if you think about how you then get an entire community to basically keep girls out of marriage and in school, if I put it very simple.
Well, that's right. And I think if you look at some of the criteria under the Human Development Index, just this investment in girls, quite frankly, is extraordinary in terms of Human Development Index and the results of that. And, you know, I think it would be helpful actually just to talk about VOW and what VOW is trying to do and really some of the unique interventions that VOW is leveraging to be able to bring greater awareness to ending child marriage.
Yeah. So what happened is at some point we realized that change requires empowering local change makers, local organizations, give them the resources, the money they need in order to create the kind of change that I was describing. And so we saw a big demand from local organizations for funding, but they don't know how to get to, you know, people in the so-called wealthy West, let's put it that way, and get that money. And at the same time, I realized that whenever I or other people would talk about child marriage in audiences like this one, people would say, look, this is horrendous. I mean, I can imagine how terrible this must be. You know, I have daughters and I couldn't imagine that this would happen to them. And so often people would say, what can I do? So we felt there's a willingness to support, there's a supply of potential funding, there is an enormous need for funding. What if we could match those two? And at that time, I happened to go to the wedding of friends of mine. And I had this moment, which I guess many of you will recognize, where it's a week before the wedding and you get a panic, not only what will I wear, but also what should I buy them as a present. And so I went to the wedding website of my friends and it said, look, either buy from this wedding registry list at, you know, Bloomingdale's or what have you, or give to this good cause. And that was a light bulb moment. I thought, wait, what if we could make sure that when people, under happy circumstances, celebrate love, whether it is an anniversary, whether it is a wedding, whether it is, you know, a second wedding, whether it is, you know, people celebrating, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu celebrated at some point 60 years of marriage. What if people who, under happy circumstances celebrate love, help to make sure that girls elsewhere in the world can also choose love on their own terms? And so that's where the idea of vow for girls, like to take a vow, that's what the name comes from. And so basically we're trying to work with, and we look then into the wedding industry. I mean, everybody sits safely. The wedding industry globally is $400 billion a year. In the United States alone is $100 billion a year. Now, if we can get a tiny bit of that money, and I'm not asking for much, I only want 0.05%. If we get only 0.05% of that money, that would mean $50 million every year going to projects on the ground in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. Small grants, 20,000 here, 50,000 there. That money would go there, and that would really help to tackle this child marriage crisis. And so Vow for Girls is basically an opportunity for everybody who wants to contribute to this effort to create a world where girls can be girls and not brides, to make sure that that world gets created by contributing, whether it's small amounts, whether it's bigger amounts. And we do that by, there are products that people can buy, and then a percentage goes to Vow for Girls. As I said, people can celebrate happy moments. We were very honored last summer when a fellow citizen of yours from the Bay Area, Sheryl Sandberg, she got married. And she and her husband, Tom, decided to ask all their wedding guests to give to VOW. And also she and her husband made a donation, so that was wonderful. And so we hope that will inspire others. But so we're trying to basically make sure that make it possible for everybody to contribute to this cause.
Well, and then you sit sort of in this really, thank you, please, yes. Actually, having been the father of 2 children that got married, I'm not surprised it's a $400 billion industry, so not shocked whatsoever by that. But you sit at this really unique intersection, I think. It's not as if you're feeding this extraordinarily large organization as much as you have contacts around the world of community-based organizations in regions and countries and cities, literally around the world, that are doing work in this space. And you've kind of nurtured, my impression is you've nurtured an extraordinary network of organizations that are engaged in that.
Yeah, we're basically trying to make it possible for everybody to contribute, and then for people all over the world to actually do the work. So it feels a bit like VOW for Girls is like a kind of a facilitator, a backbone organization, making it possible for everybody to contribute to change. And this is, it goes back, and you might find this interesting, it goes back to one of the first trips I made around ending child marriage, because the elders at some point traveled to Ethiopia to learn more about child marriage and work on, raise awareness. And I did a preparatory trip to the northern Ethiopia. And one of the interesting things I learned there was, because many people think like, oh, child marriage, that must be in the Middle East and that must be, something Islamic. And again, prejudices never serve people right, because first of all, the reality is that child marriage happens across all religions, but there's not one holy book that says, hey, marry your kids before the age of 18, just to be very clear. But also, for example, in Ethiopia, the south is Islamic, and child marriage rates there are about 15%. The north is Orthodox Christian, and child marriage rates there are about 80%. Anyway, we went to the north, and we met a group of married girls. And so I asked the girl who I was seated next to, like, how old were you when you got married? And the girl said, I don't really know, because I don't know when I was born. I don't have a birth certificate. But I must have been married off when I was between 5 and 7 years old. And when I heard that, I'm so shocked. My daughters at that time were 5 and 6 years old. Mm. And I realized if they had been born there rather than to me, this might have been their future. And this goes back to the story I told you about how I got engaged committed to do this kind of work when I was young, because I got this feeling that this is wrong. Geography should not define destiny. Mm. Everybody in the world deserves equal opportunity. And if I then think about all these girls that I've met in the last years, and the girls who ended up, being able to continue to go to school, I mean, really feisty girls who, got upset that they got married and didn't want their younger sisters to happen to their younger sisters. So, like, for example, in Zambia, there were these 2 girls that ended up taking their cases to the highest court of Zambia, and they won the case, and that's helping, not Zambia, Zimbabwe, sorry, that's helping to, change what's happening in Zimbabwe. You see all these things, and you realize change is really possible. And that makes me incredibly excited. The only thing is, as I was saying, we need to accelerate. We need to accelerate because, the demographic wind is against us, the poly crisis, that word, is against, and so we need to just do more.
Well, that's right. And folks, we'll take questions here in a few minutes. So if you have a question, I would just encourage you to, I believe we have somebody walking around to pick up various questions, and we'll field your questions with Mabel. I kind of want to return back to, I'm still relishing my 15-minute taxi ride yesterday with this new American citizen from Afghanistan. And what I also found really unique about that, as I was reflecting on that later, is that all too often we kind of think, okay, this is a we sort of categorize this and say, well, this, may not have anything to do with men. Women in leadership should take this. And what was unique about that conversation with this young man is that he really spoke to say, we need men in Afghanistan to be standing up and speaking about this. And, he's a young man, and I asked him, I said, well, what do you think about the future? And he said, things are changing. He said, the next generation and the next generation of men in this country will stand up for what is right. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about that, that this isn't the domain for just women in leadership. This is certainly the domain for men, really, to be very outspoken around the principles and the morality of this.
I completely agree. We can never achieve gender equality, and whether that is around issues of child marriage or whether it's around issues of equal pay or how people get recruited or all over the world, we cannot get that by just giving more power to women. I mean, men are part of the solution, and I've seen that in the child marriage work. I remember, for example, going to Bihar in India, where there were these young men, adolescent boys, who had figured out that child marriage wasn't the right thing and that it wasn't fair that their sisters were being married off. And they realized the power of keeping girls in school, and that makes, also for happier marriages. And so these boys had been collecting all these signatures from people in the community. And so when we went there with the elders, they gave us these handwritten booklets, and they had gathered something like 8,000 signatures only from boys and men in the community, people who had signed up saying, yeah, child marriage is not the right thing to do. And so they asked the elders then, can you please, you're going to meet the I can't remember what his formal title is, but the head of Bihar, the governor of Bihar, can you please give him these 7,000 signatures and let him see that child marriage in Bihar needs to change, and that we men and boys believe that this is important. And this is the kind of work, again, that who would have come up with the idea that was going to work in that community? Yeah. But of course, that's transformative. And once you then get men to think differently about women, once the norms around the social norms around what we think is normal changes, this kind of course girls should not get married, as opposed to of course they should get married, that is change that lasts forever. And that's why I'm actually quite hopeful that if we can get to that tipping point of making sure that girls don't get married any longer as children, that will never go back. That problem will be solved forever. Which is why, even though it looks like a daunting task, I'm actually very hopeful that we will be able to do that in one generation.
Oh, that's very exciting. I see we have some questions coming in here, and I want you to build on this question of hopefulness. Yeah. And I try to, just for my own interest, I've been trying to ask people more and more, what kind of makes you hopeful at a sort of a global level? And in some ways, coming out of 3-year pandemic, I often feel like the pandemic years were dog years. I can almost not remember what life was like in some ways before the pandemic. And I also find myself really craving to be hopeful for what the future looks like. So you operate at a level globally where I think you have an opportunity to see, some challenging moments, but also some, I hope, some hopeful moments for us. And certainly with regard to child marriage, but even across the whole human rights spectrum of challenges that we should be facing. So I'm going to ask you, what helps you to be hopeful?
Yeah. Well, it is, I think, quite easy when you look at the newspaper, whether you do that in a hard copy or online, to see a lot of stories that make you think, ooh, there's so many challenges in the world. And yes, there are. But what keeps me hopeful and makes me hopeful is the fact that that there are so many people in the world who want to do what's right. There are so many people who have enormously big hearts, and there's so many change makers out there. And I think sometimes our whole concept of how you make change happen is a little old, and that we think, you know, it has to be top down. And one of the things that I think we're showing with this movement to end child marriage is that this is not a movement with one or a few leaders. This is also not a movement that's leaderless. This is a leader-full movement. And the leaders are from people like the elders, individual elders, who really, of course, are high-profile individuals and have done a lot to put this issue on the global agenda and to keep it there. But I think of the girls in Zimbabwe who went to the court. I think of those boys in India who collected the signatures. I think of the amazing people who I met in Nepal a few weeks ago, who are doing day in, day out, this work where they convince entire communities that child marriage, you know, is not a good thing to do. I think of these, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people who are out there who are actually trying to do the right thing and who are helping to make real change happen and thereby transform the lives of girls who might have had very little opportunity and now can have bright futures. And so that really keeps me hopeful. And it also always think then of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the chair of the elders at the time. And I did several trips with him, but he would always say, I'm a prisoner of hope. And I definitely
Beautiful.
feel that I am a prisoner of hope.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Well, we have some really great and challenging questions here, Mabel.
Yeah.
And the first one that I want to queue up is sort of near and dear to my heart because I was at once the father of a girl who was 18. So I love this question. Mm-hmm. And the question is, why is 18 an acceptable age for girls to marry?
When we started the work around child marriage, there was the question of like, what is the age? And the reason why we're advocating for 18 as the minimum age of marriage is in a way very simple. First of all, the Convention of the Rights of the Child is the convention that has signed by every country in the world except for one. And that is very, very clear about the fact that a child is anybody under the age of 18. And so when the elders debated this, it was actually Mary Robinson, who, as you know, has a tremendous record in human rights. She said, look, this is very clear. 18, that's the age. And any girl who's 17 and is really keen to get married, well, let her wait a few months.
Thank you, Mabel.
Or boy, for that matter. The other thing is that actually child marriage rates have been measured for a very long time through these, what they call DHS surveys, where a lot of statistics are measured in countries all over the world. And the two things that have been measured for many decades are girls married by the age of 15 and girls married by the age of 18. And so also, therefore, using 18 is also practically very helpful because we can just keep track of what is happening over the decades.
So another question here, very interesting. The question is, I'm struck by your language that, quote, no girl is ever a bride, end quote. Can you say more about that for contexts where people do make their own choices about marriage? Is the term, quote, bride problematic? And what word should we be using or framing in that use? So
the idea of no girl should ever be a bride is like a girl, i.e. somebody under the age of 18.
Got it.
And here again, the thought is like girls, only should get married once they're beyond 18. The word bride is obviously interesting in that when we think about marriage and when we think about brides and all those words, we think about happy things. And what is sometimes hard to imagine is that child brides in those countries, it's nothing happy. I mean, there are in most cases no happy ceremonies. There's in many cases there's fear. Girls leaving their parental home to go live, in many cases, with a man who is a bit older than they are, who they've, in many cases, never met, They go off. In some cases, they end up being the de facto slaves for their in-laws. I mean, these are, and so for example, we also never want to. I mean, these are very unhappy circumstances, basically. And so we try to be very careful with the language we use. We try to be incredibly careful with the images we use, because what in the end we want to get across is that what we're after is girls being able to choose their own futures. And it's the marriage, the child marriage, that is the impediment. But what the goal is, I mean, this is not going to be a success if every girl in the world stays out of marriage, but then is forced to get married at age 18 plus 1 day. Mm-hmm. What we're really after is making sure that every girl, anywhere in the world, wherever she is born, rich, poor, gets the opportunities that I got, that your daughter got, and that all your children get, or that the young people here in the audience, all the opportunities you have to study. And that's what this is really about.
Mm-hmm. Another question is, to what extent are you, through VOW, or able to support through VOW issues around promoting birth control and educating girls and families on maternal health? And is that something that VOW addresses?
Absolutely. And what we see is that there's an enormous taboo around sexuality in Africa, in Asia, but also here in the United States and in Europe. And anybody who has tried to, talk to their own children about sex knows how hard it is. I mean, I have 2 teenage girls, and that's not easy to talk about it. Not because it can get awkward and what have you. I mean, you'll know this. But what we see is therefore, and so in societies that are more traditional, maybe that becomes even harder. But these are issues that cannot be ignored, because too often have I met girls. I mean, I remember a girl we were in Zambia with Archbishop Tutu, and we met this girl, and she said, yeah, I was one of the best students at my school, but then, the boys in the village started playing with me. I had never heard about sex. I didn't know nothing about how you get pregnant, but I found myself pregnant. I had to leave school, and I'm now, living with my baby, and my husband has abandoned me and our child. Now, of course, she wished that this girl had had an opportunity to learn about sex, and then hopefully she could have, prevented pregnancy. There's also, I mean, I remember meeting this place where they were doing sex education. It was in Indonesia, but there was such a taboo around the issue that they taught the girls they should not get pregnant. And then I met the girls and I said, oh, this is wonderful, you're getting sex education. What did you learn? Yeah, we shouldn't get pregnant. And then I said, so how do you get pregnant? And I had forgotten to teach them how you get pregnant because there was too much of a taboo around that. Mm-hmm. And then I met girls, who actually had learned all these things. But this girl, she knew that there was a boy, a man, I don't know, a young man, preying on her sexually. And so she went to the clinic and she said, look, I know that this boy might actually molest me sexually. Can I please get contraceptives? And she gets yelled at because she's underage and she shouldn't be thinking about sex. Well, do you think that was going to help her? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around the issue of sexuality, of family planning. But we also, again, I mean, I'm sharing some sad stories, but then again, we also know that when girls get educated about sex and together with boys, I mean, we've seen sometimes that happens separately, sometimes it happens, boys and girls together. And when they have access to contraceptives, they can thereby make sure that they don't get pregnant, at a too young age, or with the boys or the men with whom they don't want to spend the rest of their lives. So it's a very important issue. And it's not easy, but again, the fact that something isn't easy doesn't mean that we shouldn't tackle it. And again, it can't then be me or any of you walking into the community. It has to be trusted locals who know where the sensitivities are and who know how you can actually do these kinds of reproductive health lessons.
Well, an additional question here we had is that at the beginning of our talk today, you framed up the relationship between girl marriage and female genital mutilation. And one of the questions is, do those go hand in hand? Are you seeing that evidence in the field? And is there any evidence that female genital mutilation is decreasing in the same ways that you saw girl marriage go from 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 5. Do you have any insights there?
So female genital mutilation, if I remember correctly, happens to, I think, about 2 million girls every year. So the numbers are quite different, and that is partially because female genital mutilation, contrary to child marriage happens all over the world. Female genital mutilation happens, I believe, in around 30 countries primarily. So it's a smaller geographical area. There isn't always a link. I mean, there are obviously both harmful practices. Both need to end. But only in a few countries are they directly related. In a place like, so you can have, for example, in Senegal, you can have girls who have been cut, but not necessarily become child brides, or you have child brides who have not been cut. There are only a few places where actually the two are connected, and one is among in Kenya, where when a girl gets her first period, that's the moment when she gets cut, and then once she has been cut, she starts wearing different beads, and then people know, like, oh, this is now, she's a young woman, she has been cut, now she's ready for marriage, and then they normally get married fairly shortly thereafter. So in that case, if you want to end child marriage, you need to work on the issue of cutting as well. And but in other places, even though the two are not directly linked, when you work around social norm change, the sensitization, of parents and village elders about what is good for girls and not good for girls, you can work on both issues at the same time, even though they are not directly connected.
Mm-hmm. Well, we were talking yesterday, and you were explaining to me some of the interesting opportunities in front of VOW, and I'm just curious, as we move towards having to wrap up our conversation, sort of what's next for VOW, and what are some of the opportunities that VOW has in front of it, and something that we should know about among ourselves?
Well, so we launched VOW for Girls shortly before the COVID pandemic. And so as you can imagine, that was a bit of a hard time to start an organization that is all around celebrations and weddings. And so we are happy that the pandemic is over for many reasons, but including this. And we're very happy to see that, there's this enormous wedding boom now. And what we're also excited about is that VOW is currently supporting about 200 projects in 6 countries. Mm. And we see that the first results of these projects are really, very promising. And it is so enormously exciting when you see that small grants make an enormous difference for an entire community, and how then parents start telling you proudly, like, we now know that this is not good. We are now, obeying to the law, and we will not marry our daughters at a young age, and take pride in this and understand that this is good, not just for the girls, but for the community as a whole. So what's for VOW? Well, VOW is the kind of organization that will only be as good as everybody, as we collectively make it. And this is a little bit, it brings me back to thinking about Archbishop Tutu. Because he would, I used to call him Arch, and Arch would say often, when you want big change to happen, and obviously wanting to end child marriage means that we want big change to happen, he said, when you want big change to happen, you need an enormous wave of change. And he said, never forget that a big wave is composed of millions of drops of water. And you can be one, 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 and you can be one of those drops, and I am one of those drops, and you can be one of those drops. And I love that, because I really believe that's the way that change happens. It goes back to that ideal of, leaderful movements of change. And so what the potential VOW basically depends on how many millions of drops of water will join this wave of change. And I mean, as I said, we would love to mobilize just a tiny bit of that enormous wedding market and anything that comes with it. And everybody has an opportunity to help. So I invite you to join that wave.
Oh, you know, we're accustomed to this idea of an atmospheric river, so maybe we can bring an atmospheric river of drops to bear for vow. And I just, you know, one of our last questions, it wasn't really even a question. I just am so inspired by this. Gentleman here wrote, "I'm a man, and I agree we should help," all in uppercase. "I just went online and made a donation to Vow for Girls." So that's the beginning of our atmospheric river here from the Bay Area to support this.
Thank you very much.
And well, listen, we just have a few more minutes left here, and in real time, I'm reading this question. And here's the question: there's a police crackdown on underage marriage happening in India. That's been controversial. What is going on, Mabel?
So India, for more than 100 years, has had a law which says 18 is the minimum age of marriage. At the same time, the child marriage rates used to be around 50%, 1 out of every 2 girls getting married before 18. That's now decreased to 27%. But because India is a big country, an enormous population, the absolute numbers are still very, very high. In one of the states in India, I believe it's Assam, a few weeks ago, the authorities decided to arrest about 2,000 men who had married girls under the age of 18, saying, look, this is against the law. Yes, they broke the law. But by putting these men in prison, that doesn't necessarily, you know, solve the problem. And what happened in that particular case, from what I know about it, is the wives and their children actually went protesting and said, look, we're poor families. If our husbands are in prison, they can't earn, you know, they can't put bread on the table, rice on the table for us. So they need to be liberated. And we know that criminalization doesn't necessarily solve the problem. I mean, you, in the end, what you need is actually the kind of change. You need to make sure there are alternatives for girls. You need to make sure that people realize that this is harmful. And if you criminalize it, what we have seen in most places is you drive the practice underground, which is, again, not a solution. To the contrary, it makes vulnerable girls even more at risk of abuse and other, you know, other things that are bad for them. So that's, as far as what I understand, is happening in part of India right now. And I actually don't know whether these men have been liberated. I'll check that later.
Okay. Well, listen, this is the last question of the day, and I think it's a perfect one to end on. This individual wrote, if we choose to give to a wedding gift of vow to a couple unaware of the org and its work, does such a donation on their behalf come with anything that explains vow? And just walk us through the mechanics of how to give, you know, what you're giving and how people become aware of vow. Okay,
so there is a website, vowforgirls.org, which should explain all of this in ways that make it really simple. It helps to identify where you can buy products, of which then a part of the proceeds will actually go to vow. It helps to also explain, like, what you can do if you want to gift to, you know, a donation to vow to a couple, how to make sure that gets acknowledged. It explains what you can do if you decide to vow your own wedding or another celebration, how to do that. And I'm not an expert in this, you know, in this field, but we have a wonderful team here in the United States that makes sure that all this can be done in a way that is as painless as you know, as possible for all of you. Actually becomes really easy, but also that shows them where the money goes. So there is an enormous amount of information about the kind of stories around girls who have benefited from the generous donations of people like yourselves, and helps to basically show why this is a wonderful way of celebrating. And it's interesting, we see that I mean, the Generation Z and the millennials, they are much more, I think, inclined than previous generations to kind of make a good cause part of celebrations, and that's obviously something that we warmly welcome. But if for whatever reason you feel that it is not clear enough on the website, then our friends at the Commonwealth Club know where to find me and my colleagues. And we will help you make sure that this works out.
Well, listen, thank you, Princess Mabel Van Orange, for joining us today. And I think it's fair to say the world is truly a better place because of you. And so if we will, let's...
Thank you.
And thank you. I know Mabel and members of the VOW team will be here afterwards if you'd like to speak to them. And for our online audience, I'd just like to say that if you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person gatherings possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. And thank you, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.